Some discoveries change everything you thought you knew about survival. As the polar wind changed direction, the ancient settlers noticed something in the ice, a dark shape that shouldn't have been there, frozen in the translucent blue wall of the glacier that towered above their winter camp. Erik was the first to see it clearly. He'd been checking the fishing nets through the ice holes when the wind shifted from east to west, and suddenly the low morning sun hit the glacier face at a different angle. The light penetrated deeper into the ancient ice, revealing what had been hidden in shadow for countless generations. "Come quickly," he called to the others, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. His wife Sarah emerged from their stone and turf dwelling, wrapped in layers of sealskin and wool. Their settlement of 12 families had been here for 3 winters now, having migrated from the southern valleys when game had grown scarce and the population too large for the land to support. "What is it?" she asked, walking carefully across the packed snow. Erik pointed at the glacier. "There, do you see it?" Sarah shaded her eyes and looked where he indicated. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the familiar wall of ice that formed the northern boundary of their settlement, the same ancient frozen river they'd lived beside since arriving. Then the wind shifted again, the sun's angle changed subtly, and she saw it. A structure. Wooden beams, too regular to be natural, too deliberate to be anything but human-made. "What is that?" she whispered. By midday, the entire settlement had gathered to look at the discovery. The object in the ice was perhaps 30 feet above the valley floor, embedded deep in the glacier's face. As the sun continued its low arc across the sky, more details became visible. Wooden posts, carefully shaped, what looked like roof cumbers, the dark shapes that might have been tools or weapons. "It's a dwelling," said Magnus, the settlement's eldest member. He was nearly 60, ancient by their standards, and his long life had given him knowledge of many things. "Someone lived here before us, long before us, judging by how deep it is in the ice." "How long?" asked Peter, one of the younger hunters. Magnus studied the glacier thoughtfully. "The ice moves slowly, but it moves. For something to be that deep, hundreds of years, maybe more." The settlers stood in silence, contemplating this. They thought themselves the first people to inhabit this harsh northern land. The valleys to the south held other settlements, other families who'd migrated north over generations, but this far into the polar regions, they'd seen no evidence of previous human habitation. Until now. "We should investigate," Erik said. "Whatever is up there, it might contain things we can use, tools perhaps, or knowledge about surviving in this place." "The ice could be unstable," Sarah cautioned. "Climbing up there might be dangerous."
"Everything here is dangerous," Erik replied. "But we've survived 3 winters. We know how to be careful." Magnus nodded slowly. "He's right. If there's something up there that can help us, we need to know about it. But we approach this wisely. We take our time. The ice has held that dwelling for hundreds of years. It will hold it a few days longer while we plan properly." They spent the next 2 days preparing for the climb. Erik and Peter, being the strongest and most experienced climbers, would make the ascent. They gathered rope made from braided seal hide, iron spikes they could drive into the ice, and tools for chipping away at the frozen surface. The other settlers prepared in their own ways. The women reinforced the men's warmest clothing, adding extra layers and checking every seam for weakness. The cold at the height of the glacier face would be worse than on the valley floor, and exposed skin could freeze in moments. The children, fascinated by the discovery, spent hours staring at the dark shape in the ice, inventing stories about who might have lived there and why they'd been frozen in the glacier. The elders listened to these stories with knowing smiles, remembering their own childhoods and the tales they'd been told. On the morning of the 3rd day, conditions were perfect. The wind was calm, the sky clear, and the temperature, while still well below freezing, was warmer than it had been, as much as one could hope for in the polar winter. Erik kissed Sarah and their 2 children goodbye. "I'll be careful," he promised. "You'd better be," Sarah replied, adjusting the hood of his parka one last time. "I didn't come all this way north just to lose you to curiosity about some old frozen house." Peter said his own goodbyes to his family, and then the 2 men approached the glacier face. They'd chosen their route carefully over the previous days, a path that followed natural features in the ice, using ridges and protrusions that would give them handholds and places to secure their ropes. The first 20 feet were relatively easy. The ice here was rough and provided good grip for their spiked boots. They climbed steadily, testing each handhold before trusting their weight to it. Behind them, the settlement watched in tense silence. But as they climbed higher, the angle of the glacier face became steeper. The ice here was smoother, older, compressed by centuries of weight from above.
Erik hammered in an iron spike and secured his rope to it, then continued upward. Peter followed, using the same spike as an anchor point. "How much further?" Peter called up. Erik looked at the dark shape above them. 10 feet, maybe 12. They climbed carefully, methodically, placing spikes every few feet. One slip here could mean a fatal fall onto the rocks below. The cold was intense this high up, the wind stronger, despite being calm by polar standards. Erik could feel his fingers growing numb inside his mittens.
Finally, he reached the level of the frozen structure. Up close, it was clearly a dwelling, a house built in the style of their own homes, with wooden beams forming a frame that would have been covered with turf and stone. But this one had been caught by the advancing glacier and frozen in place, preserved perfectly in the ice. "Pass me the chisel," Erik called down to Peter. Peter handed up the iron tool, and Erik began carefully chipping at the ice surrounding one of the wooden beams. The ice was incredibly hard, and progress was slow. But gradually he created a small opening, a hole just large enough to peer through. He pressed his face close to the opening, shading his eyes to see better into the darkness beyond the ice. What he saw made him catch his breath. "What is it?" Peter asked. "What do you see?" Erik pulled back from the opening, his mind struggling to process what his eyes had shown him. "There were people in there," he said quietly. "Or there were people. They're frozen, preserved in the ice like the house itself." The news rippled through the settlement like wind across water. The elders called a meeting that evening in the communal hall, where important decisions were made and disputes settled. "We need to decide what to do," Magnus said, addressing the assembled families. "We've discovered something significant. Our ancestors, perhaps, or at least people like us who lived in this place long ago. The question is whether we continue investigating or leave them in peace." "We should learn from them," argued Erik. "Whatever happened to them, whatever led to their dwelling being swallowed by the glacier, we need to understand it. What if the same thing could happen to us?" "The glacier has been stable since we arrived," countered Helena, one of the elder women, "and these people were frozen hundreds of years ago. The conditions that led to their fate may not exist anymore." "Or they may return," Erik replied. "We don't know. That's the point. If we can learn why they ended up in the ice, we might be able to prevent the same fate." Sarah spoke up. "There's also the practical matter. If that dwelling contains tools or supplies, things that have been preserved in the ice, they could help us survive here. We came north with what we could carry, but more resources would make our lives easier." The debate continued for hours. Some settlers felt they should respect the dead and leave the frozen dwelling undisturbed. Others argued that the practical benefits outweighed spiritual concerns. Finally, Magnus called for a decision. "All those who believe we should continue investigating, make yourselves known." The majority of hands went up, including Sarah's and Erik's. "Then it's decided. But we proceed respectfully. These were people like us who tried to survive in this harsh place. Whatever we find, we treat with dignity." Over the following days, Erik and Peter made several more climbs to the glacier face.
Each time they chipped away more ice, gradually creating a larger opening. The work was exhausting and dangerous, but they persevered. As the opening grew, they could see more of the dwelling's interior. It had been a home much like their own, a single large room with a central hearth, sleeping platforms along the walls, and storage areas for food and supplies. And everywhere, the evidence of people who had lived here. Clothing hanging on pegs, tools arranged neatly on shelves, cooking vessels near the hearth. And the people themselves, 4 of them, frozen in positions that suggested they'd been caught by surprise. A man and woman, perhaps husband and wife, and 2 others who might have been their children or other family members. Their faces were preserved remarkably well in the ice, expressions peaceful, as if they'd simply fallen asleep. "How did they die?" Peter wondered aloud. "There's no sign of violence, no obvious injury." "The cold, perhaps," Erik suggested. "Or maybe smoke from their fire if the chimney was blocked. We may never know." But as they continued excavating, they found something that suggested a different answer. In the far corner of the dwelling, partially hidden behind a storage shelf, was a journal. The leather cover was frozen solid, but through the ice they could see pages filled with writing. "We need to get that," Erik said. "Whatever is written there might explain what happened." It took another full day of careful chipping to free the journal from the ice. When they finally succeeded, Erik climbed down with it wrapped carefully in sealskin to protect it from moisture. The entire settlement gathered as Magnus prepared to open it. "The ice has preserved it," Magnus said, examining the journal carefully.
But we must be gentle. The pages will be fragile. He opened the cover slowly, revealing the first page. The writing was in their own language, or something very close to it, a dialect they could understand with effort. "It's a record," Magnus said, beginning to read, "a record of their settlement here, and of what happened to them." The settlers leaned in, listening intently as Magnus began to translate the ancient words. The journal had been kept by a man named Thomas, the leader of the settlement that had once existed where Erik's people now lived. His first entries described their arrival in the valley, much like Erik's own people's arrival 3 winters ago. "We came north seeking new land and new opportunities," Magnus read aloud. "The southern valleys had grown crowded, and game was scarce. Here, in this remote northern place, we found abundant seals, fish in the frozen waters, and caribou that migrated through in the spring and fall. We built our homes and prepared for winter." The early entries were optimistic, describing successful hunts and the construction of sturdy dwellings. Thomas wrote about his family, his wife Margaret, their son William, and their daughter Emma.
The journal painted a picture of a community much like their own, working together to survive in the harsh polar environment. But as Magnus continued reading, the tone of the entries began to change. "The ice is advancing," Magnus read from an entry dated late in Thomas's second winter. "What was distant when we arrived now looms close to our settlement. The glacier that overlooks our valley has moved perhaps 20 feet closer to our homes. The elders say this is normal, that glaciers move and retreat in cycles, but the speed of it concerns me." Later entries showed growing alarm. The glacier continued to advance, moving faster than anyone had expected. Thomas described how the settlement had tried to move their dwellings, to relocate to a safer position in the valley. But the work was slow, and the glacier's advance was relentless. "We are trapped," Magnus read from one of the later entries. "The glacier has blocked the valley's northern end. What was once our water source is now a wall of ice bearing down on us. We are attempting to move south, to escape the advance, but the winter storms have made travel nearly impossible." The final entries were brief and desperate. Thomas described how the glacier had finally reached their dwelling, how they'd been caught inside during a storm, unable to escape. The last entry was dated 3 days after the glacier had surrounded their home. "We are warm still, and we have food for a few more days. But the ice surrounds us completely now. We cannot dig out. The walls are too thick, and our tools cannot cut through fast enough. The air is growing stale. Margaret says we must try to break through the roof, but the ice has covered it as well. I fear this may be our tomb. To whoever finds this journal, if anyone ever does, take warning. The glaciers here are not stable. They can advance without warning, trapping everything in their path. Do not make the mistake of believing they are permanent fixtures. They are alive in their own way, moving and changing. Respect them, and always have an escape route planned." Magnus closed the journal carefully. The gathered settlers sat in stunned silence, processing what they'd heard. "They were overtaken by the glacier," Sarah said finally. "It advanced and swallowed their settlement whole. And we've built our homes in the same place," Peter added. "What if the same thing happens to us?" Magnus looked around at the worried faces. "That's why we needed to know. Thomas left us a warning, and we must heed it. We need to study the glacier, to watch for signs of movement, and we need to prepare, to have a plan for moving quickly if necessary." Erik stood up. "I'll establish markers along the glacier face. We'll measure any movement, track it daily. If it starts to advance, we'll know immediately. And we should prepare emergency supplies," Sarah suggested. "Things we can grab quickly if we need to evacuate. We won't be caught unprepared like Thomas and his family." The meeting continued late into the night as the settlers planned their response to this new knowledge. The ancient dwelling had given them a gift, a warning from the past that might save their lives in the future. Over the following weeks, the settlement transformed. Erik placed wooden stakes at precise intervals along the glacier face, measuring and recording their positions each morning. He created a detailed map showing the glacier's current extent and checking it against landmarks in the valley. The families packed emergency kits, bags containing food, warm clothing, and essential tools that could be grabbed at a moment's notice. They identified safe routes out of the valley and cached supplies along these routes in case they needed to evacuate during a storm. But even as they prepared, they continued to investigate the frozen dwelling. With Magnus's blessing, Erik and Peter carefully removed several items from the ancient home. Tools that had been preserved perfectly in the ice, knives, axes, fishing hooks. These they cleaned and added to their own supplies. They also found seeds, stored in clay pots and frozen before they could sprout. Sarah, who tended the settlement's small summer garden, examined these with interest. "These are varieties we don't have," she said, "hardy plants adapted to this climate. If we can grow them, they might provide food that our current crops cannot." The most valuable find, however, was another journal, this one kept by Margaret, Thomas's wife. While Thomas had focused on practical matters and observations about the glacier, Margaret had written about survival techniques, recipes for preserving food, methods for treating injuries and illnesses with local plants. "This is knowledge we've been learning through trial and error," Sarah said, reading through Margaret's careful notes. "She's saved us years of experimentation." Magnus spent hours reading both journals, cross-referencing Thomas's observations about the glacier with Margaret's notes about daily life. Together, these records painted a complete picture of what life had been like for the ancient settlers. "They were much like us," Magnus observed, "facing the same challenges, finding the same solutions. The tools we use, the techniques for hunting seals through ice holes, the methods for preserving meat, they discovered all of these same things. We're following in their footsteps without knowing it." One evening, as the perennial twilight of polar winter settled over the valley, Erik climbed once more to the frozen dwelling. This time he went alone, wanting a quiet moment to reflect on what they'd discovered. He peered through the opening they'd created, looking at the preserved faces of Thomas and his family. In the low light, they almost seemed to be sleeping rather than dead. "Thank you," Erik said quietly. "Thank you for the warning and for the knowledge. We'll remember you. We'll honor what you've taught us." As he prepared to climb back down, something caught his eye. Near the hearth, partially hidden in shadow, was something they hadn't noticed before. He chipped away more ice, working carefully until he could see what it was. A carved wooden figure, small enough to fit in his palm. It depicted a family, 2 adults and 2 children, standing together. On the base was carved a single word, "together." Erik removed the carving carefully and tucked it inside his parka. When he returned to the settlement, he showed it to Magnus and the others. "This is what saved them, in a way," Magnus said, holding the carving gently. "Not their lives, those were lost, but their memory, their knowledge, their warning to us. They stayed together, faced the end together, and left behind everything they'd learned so that others might survive." He placed the carving in the center of the communal hall, on the stone ledge above the hearth. "This will remind us. We are not the first to live here, and if we're wise and fortunate, we won't be the last. The knowledge passes forward, generation to generation." Spring came slowly to the polar north, marked not by warmth but by increasing daylight. The sun began to appear above the horizon for longer periods each day, though the temperature remained well below freezing. Erik continued his daily measurements of the glacier. For weeks, the markers showed no movement. The ancient ice remained stable, neither advancing nor retreating. But he didn't become complacent. Thomas's journal had taught him that glaciers could move suddenly, advancing rapidly after long periods of stability. The settlement began to change in other ways too. Using Margaret's notes, Sarah and the other women experimented with new food preservation techniques. They tried growing the ancient seeds in small indoor gardens, using precious lamp oil to provide light during the dark winter months. To everyone's surprise, some of the seeds germinated, hardy plants that grew slowly but surely, even in the low light and cold. By late spring, they had small crops of vegetables that their original seeds hadn't been able to produce. Margaret knew what she was doing, Sarah said, tending the growing plants. These varieties were developed over generations to survive here. They're a gift from the past. Peter and the other hunters began using some of the ancient tools they'd recovered. The fishing hooks in particular proved to be of superior design to their own. Carved from bone and shaped in a specific way, they caught fish more effectively than the hooks the settlers had been making. Whoever made these understood the fish here, Peter observed. The shape, the size, the weight, it's all optimized for the species in these waters. The knowledge from the frozen dwelling spread through every aspect of settlement life. Hunting techniques, clothing designs, methods for keeping dwellings warm. All of these improved as they learned from Thomas, Margaret, and their community.
But the glacier remained Erik's primary concern. Each morning, regardless of weather, he went to check his markers. And one morning in late spring, he found what he'd been dreading. The easternmost marker had moved. Only a few inches, but movement nonetheless. The glacier had begun to advance. Erik immediately called a settlement meeting. The families gathered with worry evident on their faces. They'd known this might happen, had prepared for it, but the reality was still frightening. "The glacier is moving," Erik announced. "Not quickly yet, but it's advancing. Based on Thomas's journal, we know this could accelerate. We need to decide now whether to move the settlement or wait and monitor the situation." The debate was intense. Some argued they should move immediately, relocate further down the valley where the glacier couldn't reach. Others wanted to wait, to see if the advance was temporary or would continue. Magnus listened to all sides before speaking. Thomas and his people waited too long. They delayed their decision until moving became impossible. Let's not make the same mistake. We should begin relocating now while we have time and favorable conditions. If the glacier stops advancing, we can always move back. But if it doesn't stop, we'll have already saved ourselves. The vote was unanimous. They would move. The relocation took 2 weeks of hard work. They couldn't move their stone and turf dwellings. Those would have to be rebuilt. But they could move everything else: supplies, tools, personal belongings, the precious seeds and plants they've been growing. They chose a new location 3 miles south, where the valley widened and the walls rose higher. Here, even if the glacier advanced significantly, they would be safe. The ground was rockier, requiring more effort to build on, but the security was worth it. The new dwellings went up quickly, built with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. They used the techniques they'd learned from both their own experience and from Margaret's journal. The structures were sturdier, better insulated, more thoughtfully designed than their first homes had been. As the new settlement took shape, Erik continued monitoring the glacier. The advance continued, slow but steady. Within a month, the glacier had moved forward 20 feet, exactly the rate Thomas had described in his journal before the rapid acceleration began. "We made the right choice," Magnus said, standing with Erik and looking at their old settlement site. The abandoned dwelling sat in the shadow of the advancing ice, soon to be swallowed just as Thomas's home had been. "How long before it reaches our old homes?" Peter asked. Erik calculated in his head. "Perhaps 3 months, but if it accelerates like Thomas described, it could be much sooner." They watched the glacier for a while in silence.
There was something hypnotic about it. This massive river of ice that moved too slowly to see, but inexorably reshaped the landscape. "It's beautiful, in a way," Sarah said, joining them. "Terrible, but beautiful. All that power, all that time compressed into ice." "Thomas thought so too," Magnus replied. In one of his early journal entries, before he knew the danger, he wrote about the glacier's beauty, how it glowed blue in certain light, how the ice sang as it moved. He appreciated it even as it killed him. "We can appreciate it now," Erik said, "because we are at a safe distance. That's the lesson they taught us. Respect the power of this place, but don't let wonder blind you to danger." The settlement's children, including Erik's own, played nearby under the watchful eyes of the elders. They were laughing, chasing each other through the snow, living the same kind of childhood their parents had lived in the southern valleys. But they were growing up harder, shaped by this northern land and its demands. "Do you think they'll stay?" Sarah asked. "When they're grown, will they remain here or move back south?" "I don't know," Erik admitted. "This is home to them now, but the south offers advantages we don't have. Warmer weather, more abundant food, larger communities. Some will stay, some will go. That's natural." Magnus nodded. "Each generation makes its own choice. We came north seeking something: space, opportunity, challenge. Our children may seek something different. What matters is that we pass forward what we've learned, just as Thomas and Margaret did for us." Summer in the polar north was brief and precious. The temperature rose above freezing for a few weeks, and the landscape transformed. Snow melted in patches, revealing rocky ground and hardy vegetation. Birds arrived in large numbers, nesting in the cliffs and feeding in the exposed water. The settlement's children delighted in finding flowers, tiny, tough plants that bloomed quickly and brilliantly before winter returned. The hunters had good success during the summer months. Seals were abundant, and the migrating caribou passed through the valley as Thomas had described. The settlement's food stores grew, giving them security against the long winter to come. But even during this time of plenty, Erik maintained his watch on the glacier, and what he saw concerned him deeply. The advance had accelerated, just as Thomas had warned it might. The ancient ice was now moving forward at nearly 1 foot per day. Their old settlement site was directly in the glacier's path. Erik watched as one by one the abandoned dwellings were reached and overtaken by the advancing ice.
The process was fascinating and terrible. The glacier didn't simply crush the structures. Instead, it surrounded them, lifted them, and slowly incorporated them into its frozen mass.
In a few hundred years, Magnus observed, someone else might discover our old homes, frozen in the glacier just as we discovered Thomas's dwelling. They'll find our tools, our supplies, maybe even journals if we'd left any behind. The cycle continues. Should we leave something? Peter asked. A message for whoever finds them? Erik considered this. Yes, we should. Not a journal. We didn't leave those behind. But something simple. A marker, a carving, something that says we were here, and we survived because we learned from those who came before. They spent an evening crafting a stone marker, carving into it a simple message. We came, we learned, we moved. The ice advances, but we endure. Learn from our example as we learned from others. Erik climbed to the old settlement site one final time before the glacier made access impossible. He placed the stone marker in the center of what had been the communal gathering area. Perhaps it would be incorporated into the ice, perhaps not. But it felt important to leave something, to mark their passage through this place. As he stood there, preparing to leave, he noticed something strange. The glacier's surface was changing, developing cracks and fissures that hadn't been there before. He approached cautiously, staying well back from the ice face, and observed the patterns. The cracks formed a network, spreading across the glacier's surface like a spider's web. And from deep within the ice came sounds, groans and cracks, the voice of the glacier as it moved and stressed and adjusted to its own massive weight. Erik hurried back to the new settlement and reported what he'd seen. Magnus listened carefully, then consulted Thomas's journal, searching for any mention of similar phenomena. Here, Magnus said, finding a passage. Thomas wrote about this. He said when the glacier began to show surface cracks, it meant the advance was reaching its maximum. The ice was under too much stress, moving too fast for its own structure. He predicted it would either stop advancing soon or break apart dramatically. Break apart? Sarah asked. What does that mean? A calving event, Magnus explained. When part of the glacier breaks off suddenly, it can be dangerous. Blocks of ice the size of houses falling and sliding. That's another reason Thomas's people couldn't escape. The glacier wasn't just advancing, it was becoming unstable all around them. We're far enough away, Erik said, aren't we? Magnus measured the distance with his eyes. We should be, but we'll set watches, just in case. If the glacier calves, we need to see it coming. That night, they established a watch rotation. 2 people at all times, positioned where they could see the glacier and sound an alarm if necessary. It was an extra burden on the settlement, but no one complained. The lesson of Thomas's people was too fresh, too immediate. The calving event came 3 days later, in the middle of the night. The watchguards saw it first, a deep groaning sound that built to a roar. Then a massive section of the glacier's face broke free, thousands of tons of ice sliding and tumbling down onto the valley floor. The ground shook with the impact, and the noise was like thunder that went on and on. The settlement woke in panic, everyone rushing from their dwellings. But Magnus stood calmly in the center of the camp, holding up his hands for quiet. "Stay calm," he called out. "We're safe. This is what we prepared for." They watched as the calving continued for several minutes, block after block of ancient ice breaking free and crashing down. In the darkness, they couldn't see details, but they could hear it, the violence of ice giving way, the transformation of the glacier's shape and structure. When dawn came, they could see the extent of what had happened. The glacier's face had retreated by nearly 200 feet. Where their old settlement had been, now there was nothing but a chaotic jumble of ice blocks, some as large as their dwellings. And visible in the new glacier face, exposed by the calving, were more frozen structures, more ancient dwellings, even older than Thomas's had been. The glacier had held them for even longer, preserving them in ice for generations beyond counting. There were others before Thomas, Peter said, staring at the newly revealed structures. Others who came north, who tried to settle here, who were swallowed by the ice. Magnus nodded slowly. And we would have been next if we hadn't learned from Thomas's warning. The glacier takes and takes, but sometimes it gives back too. It gave us knowledge when we needed it most. The calving had one other effect. It seemed to stabilize the glacier. Erik's measurements over the following weeks showed the advance had stopped. The ice had broken off the portion that was most unstable,
and what remained was, for now at least, stable again. "It's breathing," Sarah said one evening as they discussed the glacier's behavior, "advancing and retreating like a living thing taking breaths." "That's not far from the truth," Magnus agreed. "The ice responds to temperature, to snowfall, to forces we don't fully understand. It moves and changes on a timescale longer than human lives, but from the ice's perspective, it's as natural as breathing." The settlement began to relax as summer progressed. The immediate danger had passed, and they'd proven they could respond effectively to threats. They'd learned from the past and applied those lessons to save themselves. But they didn't forget. The carved wooden figure remained in the communal hall, a constant reminder. The journals were copied carefully, creating multiple versions, so the knowledge wouldn't be lost if one copy was damaged. And every child in the settlement learned the story of Thomas and Margaret, the ancient settlers whose warning had saved them all.
As autumn approached and the days began to shorten again, a hunting party from the south arrived. They were from one of the settlements in the valleys where Erik's people had originated, come north to trade and to check on their distant relatives. The visitors were amazed by what they found. The settlement had not just survived, but had thrived. The hunters brought back stories of the northern settlement's success, of the knowledge they'd gained from the frozen dwelling, of their escape from the advancing glacier. "You've learned things we don't know," the lead hunter, a man named James, said. "Techniques for surviving this far north. The southern settlements could benefit from this knowledge." Magnus considered this. "The knowledge isn't ours to keep. It was given to us by those who came before. It should be shared freely so that others can survive as we have." They spent several days with the visitors, teaching them what they'd learned. Sarah showed them Margaret's food preservation techniques and the hardy plants they'd grown from the ancient seeds. Erik demonstrated the fishing hooks and explained the hunting methods that worked best in the polar environment. Magnus read passages from both journals, explaining the lessons contained within. "This is more valuable than any trade goods," James said as they prepared to leave. "You've given us knowledge that could save lives." "Then share it," Magnus replied. "Tell the southern settlements what we've learned. Tell them about Thomas and Margaret, about the glacier's warning, about the importance of respecting this land's power." After the visitors departed, heading south before the winter storms could trap them in the north, the settlement felt the satisfaction of having contributed something larger than their own survival. They'd become links in a chain of knowledge passing forward through time. Thomas and Margaret would be pleased, Sarah said that evening. They left their knowledge hoping someone would find it and benefit. Now that knowledge is spreading, helping people they never met, in times they never lived to see. Erik nodded. That's the true survival, not just of individuals or communities, but of knowledge itself. We're all temporary, just passing through. But what we learn, what we share, that can last. The children listened to this conversation with serious faces. They were growing up understanding that they were part of something larger than themselves, that their lives connected to both the past and the future in meaningful ways. One of the younger children, a girl named Anna, asked, "Will people remember us someday, like we remember Thomas and Margaret?" Magnus smiled. "Perhaps, but that's not why we do what we do. We remember Thomas and Margaret not because they were famous or important, but because they left us something useful, knowledge that saved our lives. If we do the same, if we pass forward what we learn, then we'll have lived well."
Whether we're remembered or forgotten doesn't matter as much as whether we contributed to the chain of knowledge. Winter returned with its familiar intensity. The darkness deepened, the cold strengthened, and the settlement settled into the rhythms of surviving through the polar night. But this winter was different from the previous ones. They were better prepared, equipped with knowledge from multiple sources, their own experience, Thomas and Margaret's journals, and the techniques they'd developed through trial and error. The dwellings were warmer, better insulated. The food stores were larger and more varied. The clothing was more effective at keeping out the cold. Small improvements in each area adding up to a significantly more comfortable and secure winter. Erik continued monitoring the glacier, though the darkness made it difficult. He used touch and sound as much as sight, running his hands over the marker posts to feel for displacement, listening to the ice's voice to detect changes in its movement. The glacier remained stable through the winter. Whatever cycle it followed, the calving event seemed to have brought it back to equilibrium. Erik was grateful for this, but he didn't become complacent. He'd seen how quickly conditions could change, how the seemingly stable could become dangerous. During the long, dark months, the settlement's storytellers kept the children entertained with tales, both traditional stories from the southern valleys and new stories about their time in the north. The story of discovering Thomas's frozen dwelling became a favorite, told and retold with variations as different storytellers added their own interpretations.
But Magnus made sure that the factual elements remained consistent. Stories can change with time, he explained. Details get exaggerated, facts become legends. It's important to preserve the truth alongside the stories. That's why we keep the journals safe and read from them regularly. On the winter solstice, when the darkness was deepest, the settlement held a special gathering. They lit every lamp they had, filling the communal hall with warm light, and Magnus read the final entries from Thomas's journal, the desperate words of a man facing death but still thinking about those who might come after. "Let his words remind us," Magnus said when he'd finished reading. "Let them remind us why we must stay vigilant, why we must pass knowledge forward, why we must respect the power of this land we've chosen to inhabit." The solstice marked the turning point. From here, the days would grow longer again, the sun would return, and spring would eventually follow. The cycle continued, eternal and reliable. Spring brought a surprise. When the sun returned and Erik could see the glacier face clearly again, he noticed something new. The calving event had exposed more than just additional frozen dwellings. It had revealed a passage.
Where the ice had broken away, there was a gap, a space behind the glacier's face that appeared to extend deep into the ice. It was perhaps 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, large enough for a person to enter. "Should we explore it?" Peter asked, staring at the dark opening. Erik was cautious. The ice could shift at any time. Going inside would be extremely dangerous. But Magnus saw an opportunity. "The glacier has given us access to something that's been hidden for centuries. There might be more knowledge there, more lessons from the past. I think we should look, but carefully and with proper precautions." They prepared for several days, gathering rope, lamps, and safety equipment. Erik and Peter would make the exploration, while other members of the settlement would remain outside, ready to pull them out if necessary. The passage into the ice was unlike anything they'd seen. The walls glowed blue-green with filtered light, and the air was cold enough to burn in their lungs. They moved slowly, testing each step, aware that they were walking through ancient ice that could collapse at any moment. The passage extended deeper than they'd expected, turning and branching in ways that suggested it had formed naturally as the ice had moved and stressed. They followed the main path, marking their route so they could find their way back. After perhaps 100 feet, the passage opened into a larger chamber, and there, revealed by the light of their lamps, was an astonishing sight. Not one frozen dwelling, but 5, an entire small settlement preserved in the ice. "This is older than Thomas's home," Peter whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the ice chamber. "Much older." The dwellings were built in a style neither of them recognized. The construction methods were different, the materials arranged in unfamiliar patterns. This was a settlement from a time before their people's recorded history, before the techniques and methods they took for granted had been developed. Erik approached the nearest dwelling carefully. Like Thomas's home, it had been remarkably well preserved. Through the ice, he could see the interior, simple tools, basic furnishings, evidence of people who had lived here in the distant past. "We need to document this," Erik said, "but we can't remove anything. It's too unstable here, and these dwellings should remain intact for study." They spent several hours in the ice chamber, examining what they could see, making notes and sketches. Peter found what appeared to be another journal, but it was frozen too deeply in the ice to remove safely. As they were preparing to leave, Erik noticed something carved into the ice itself near the entrance to one of the dwellings. He brushed away frost and peered closely. Symbols. Not writing in any language he recognized, but pictographs, simple images that told a story. He traced them with his finger, trying to understand.
The images showed people arriving in the valley, building dwellings, hunting and fishing. Then they showed the glacier, represented by a wavy line, advancing, the people trying to escape, and finally, the people trapped, with the wavy line surrounding them. "It's the same story," Peter said, looking at the carvings. "Different people, different time, but the same story. The glacier advanced and trapped them. And they left a warning," Erik added, "just like Thomas did, carved into the ice itself, hoping someone would find it." They emerged from the ice passage carefully, grateful to be back in the open air. The settlement gathered to hear about what they'd found, and Magnus listened with deep interest. "So it's happened multiple times," Magnus said. "The glacier advances, swallows settlements, retreats, reveals what it swallowed. It's a cycle that plays out over centuries."
Should we try to excavate the ancient settlement? Someone asked. Magnus shook his head. No, the risk is too great, and we have enough knowledge from Thomas and Margaret's journals. Let the ancient settlement remain where it is. It's a memorial to those people, and perhaps someday, when techniques improve, it can be studied properly. But for now, we leave it in peace. The years passed, and the settlement prospered. The knowledge from Thomas and Margaret's journals, combined with their own experience, allowed them to live comfortably, even in the harsh polar environment. Children grew into adults, some choosing to stay in the north, others migrating back to the southern valleys. Erik's eldest son, William, took over the responsibility of monitoring the glacier. He maintained his father's careful measurements, checking the markers daily and recording any changes. The glacier remained stable, neither advancing nor retreating significantly. Sarah's gardens flourished, producing food that supplemented their hunting and fishing. The ancient seeds had proven their worth, and Sarah had developed new varieties by careful selection, creating plants even better adapted to the northern conditions. Magnus grew older but remained active, still reading from the journals to each new generation of children. The story of Thomas and Margaret had become part of the settlement's identity, a founding myth that was completely true. New settlers arrived from the south, drawn by reports of successful communities in the far north. Erik's settlement welcomed them, sharing what they'd learned and helping them establish their own communities nearby. The knowledge continued to spread. One summer, when Erik was approaching 50 and beginning to feel his age, a group of scholars arrived from the southern cities. They'd heard about the frozen dwellings and the ancient journals, and they wanted to study them. Erik welcomed them, but was also cautious. The knowledge belongs to everyone, he told them, but the sites must be protected. We won't allow excavation that might damage what's preserved there.
The scholars agreed, and they spent several months in the settlement, examining what could be seen safely, reading the journals, and interviewing the settlers about their experiences. They brought new perspective, comparing what they found with records from other regions. The glacier cycles you've observed here happen in other polar regions too, the lead scholar, a woman named Dr. Helena, explained. It's a pattern that repeats across centuries. Ice advances during cold periods, retreats during warm periods. Understanding this cycle is crucial for anyone living in these environments. Thomas understood that, Erik said. Even though he didn't have the complete picture, he recognized the pattern and tried to warn us. Dr. Helena nodded. His journal will be invaluable to researchers. Would you allow us to make copies? Not to take the original, that should stay here, but to share the knowledge more widely. Magnus, now quite elderly but still sharp of mind, made the decision. Yes, make your copies. That's what Thomas would have wanted. The knowledge should spread as widely as possible. The scholars spent weeks carefully copying both journals, making multiple versions to ensure accuracy. They also documented the settlement's own experiences, creating a comprehensive record of polar survival techniques. You've done something remarkable here, Dr. Helena said before she and her colleagues departed. You've not just survived in one of Earth's harshest environments, you've learned from the past, adapted those lessons, and created new knowledge. This settlement is a model for how humans can live sustainably, even in extreme conditions. Erik sat with Magnus one evening after the scholars had left, watching the sun make its low circle around the horizon. They were both growing old now, their bodies showing the effects of decades in the harsh northern climate. We did well, didn't we? Erik said. Coming north, establishing the settlement, learning from Thomas and Margaret? Magnus nodded slowly. We did. We survived. And not just survived, we thrived. We took knowledge from the past and passed it forward to the future. That's all anyone can really do. Do you ever regret it? Leaving the South? Bringing your family to this hard place? No, Magnus said firmly. Life in the South was comfortable but crowded. Here we've had space to grow, challenges to meet, purposes to fulfill. My grandchildren are growing up strong and capable. They know how to survive in conditions that would kill someone from the soft southern cities. That knowledge has value. They sat in silence for a while, two old men contemplating their lives and choices. The glacier loomed in the distance, ancient and powerful, a constant reminder of the forces they'd learned to live alongside. What do you think happened to them? Erik asked finally. Thomas and Margaret and their family, in those final days when they knew they weren't going to escape? What were they thinking?
Magnus was quiet for a long moment. I think they were thinking about us. Not us specifically, they didn't know we'd exist, but about whoever might come after them, whoever might find what they'd left behind. That's why Thomas kept writing until the very end, why Margaret recorded all her knowledge. They knew they were going to die, but they also knew their knowledge could live on. That's what we're doing now, isn't it? Preparing for whoever comes after us? Yes, it's what every generation should do. Learn from the past, adapt to the present, prepare for the future. The knowledge chain continues as long as we keep it going. Erik looked at the carved wooden figure visible through the window of the communal hall. Together, he said, reading the word carved into its base. That's really what it means. Not just Thomas's family staying together, but all of us, past, present, and future, connected by shared knowledge and shared purpose. Exactly, Magnus agreed. We're all in this together, across time itself. As autumn approached and Erik's 60th birthday neared, the settlement held a celebration, not just for Erik, but for the 25th year since the settlement's founding, a quarter-century of successful habitation in the far north. The celebrations included storytelling, as always. The younger generation told their own versions of the founding stories, adding details from their own experiences. They spoke about the discovery of the frozen dwelling, the glacier's advance and the evacuation, the teachings from Thomas and Margaret's journals. But they also told new stories, stories about their own adventures and discoveries, about new techniques they'd developed, about the challenges they'd faced and overcome. The settlement's history was growing, accumulating its own traditions and legends. Erik's son William stood and spoke about the future. We've learned so much from those who came before us. Now it's our turn to contribute to that knowledge. I propose we establish our own record, our own journals documenting what we've learned, not to replace what Thomas and Margaret left us, but to add to it. The suggestion was met with enthusiasm. Several settlers began keeping detailed journals, recording not just events, but observations about the climate, the wildlife, the ice, the techniques for survival. They documented their successes and, importantly, their failures, so future generations could learn from both.
He described in detail how to read animal signs in snow, how to predict seal behavior, how to preserve meat for maximum nutrition and flavor. The settlement was becoming not just a community, but a repository of knowledge, a library of survival, written not on shelves, but in the practices and memories of its people. Winter came again, as it always did, but this winter brought something unexpected, a storm more severe than any they'd experienced since arriving in the north. The wind reached speeds that made standing upright impossible, and the snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to zero. The settlement weathered the storm, secure in their well-built dwellings, but when the storm finally cleared after 3 days, they emerged to find the landscape transformed. Snow had drifted to extraordinary depths, and the glacier had changed again. Not an advance this time, but another calving event. A massive section had broken free during the storm, though they hadn't heard it over the wind's roar. The glacier's face had retreated significantly, and in the newly exposed ice, "There are more," William called out, pointing at the glacier. "More frozen dwellings, dozens of them." They approached carefully, awed by what they saw. The glacier had revealed an entire frozen settlement, much larger than Thomas's single dwelling, or even the small community Erik and Peter had found in the ice chamber. This was a town, with streets and multiple buildings, all preserved in ice. "This must be very old," Magnus said, studying the architecture, "older than anything we've seen before." They spent the following days examining what they could see safely from the glacier's base. The buildings were constructed in styles that predated any known architecture from the region. The tools and artifacts visible through the ice were primitive but ingeniously designed. And carved into a large stone near what appeared to be the settlement's center were more symbols. Erik studied them carefully, comparing them to his sketches of the symbols he'd found in the ice chamber years ago. It's the same message, he realized, the same warning. Beware the advancing ice. Have a plan to retreat. Don't let comfort make you complacent. "How many times?" Erik asked quietly. "How many settlements has the glacier swallowed over the centuries?" "Many," Magnus said, "and each one tried to warn those who came after. The message has been passed forward for longer than we can imagine." Dr. Helena, who had stayed in touch with the settlement through letters carried by traders, traveled north again when she heard about the new discoveries. She brought more scholars with her, and they spent months studying the newly revealed ancient town.
This settlement dates back at least 1,000 years, she told the gathered settlers, possibly more. The glacier swallowed it during a period of rapid advance, then held it frozen all this time.
What you found here is invaluable for understanding ancient human adaptation to polar conditions. She examined the warning carved in stone. And they left the same message. Across 1,000 years, the same warning. That tells us something important. The pattern of glacial advance and retreat has been consistent for a very long time. Your observations, combined with Thomas's journal and these ancient warnings, give us a complete picture of the cycle. The discoveries from the ancient town led to changes in how northern settlements were planned. Based on the patterns observed over centuries, scholars could now predict with some accuracy when and where glaciers might advance. New settlements were established with this knowledge in mind, located in areas that would remain safe even during maximum glacial advance. Erik's settlement became a center of learning, with young people from southern communities coming north to study polar survival techniques. The journals, Thomas and Margaret's originals, along with the new journals being kept by current settlers, became required reading for anyone planning to live in the far north. Magnus lived to see his great-grandchildren born in the settlement. On his deathbed, at the age of 78, he called Erik to his side. "We did good work," Magnus said, his voice weak but content. "We learned from the past. We survived the present. We prepared for the future. That's all anyone can ask." "You taught us how," Erik replied. "You showed us the importance of respecting what came before." Magnus smiled. "Not me. Thomas and Margaret taught us. I just listened to what they had to say. Promise me you'll keep listening. Keep reading the journals to the children. Keep the knowledge alive." "I promise," Erik said. Magnus died peacefully that night, and the settlement mourned him deeply. They carved his name onto a stone memorial they'd established near the communal hall, a memorial that listed all the settlers who had contributed to their survival, starting with Thomas and Margaret and continuing through each generation. Erik took over Magnus's role as the settlement's eldest advisor. He continued reading from the journals, continued teaching the lessons learned from past generations, and he encouraged the younger settlers to continue adding to the body of knowledge. On Erik's 70th birthday, a delegation arrived from the southern capital. They brought news. The knowledge from the northern settlements had led to significant advances in understanding climate patterns and human adaptation. Techniques developed for polar survival were being applied in other extreme environments. "Your settlement has become famous," the delegation leader explained, "not for any single achievement, but for your approach to learning from the past and sharing knowledge freely. You've shown that human beings can thrive anywhere if we're willing to learn and adapt." Erik accepted the praise humbly.
We simply built on what others taught us. Thomas and Margaret, the ancient settlers before them, all the way back through time. We're just links in a chain. "But you kept the chain intact," the delegate replied. "Many settlements forget the past, reject old knowledge in favor of new. You honored both, preserving ancient wisdom while developing new techniques. That balance is why you've succeeded." That evening, Erik stood before the glacier one final time. His body was failing now, his strength gone, but his mind remained clear. He looked at the ancient ice, thinking about all it contained, the frozen dwellings, the preserved knowledge, the warnings left by people long dead but not forgotten. "Thank you," he said to the ice, to Thomas and Margaret, to all the unknown settlers who had tried and failed and tried again to live in this harsh place. "Thank you for the lessons. Thank you for the warnings. Thank you for not giving up even when you knew you wouldn't survive." The glacier stood silent and eternal, holding its secrets, moving on its own timescale. It had been here before humans arrived and would remain long after they were gone. But for now, for this moment, humans had learned to live alongside it, respecting its power while adapting to its presence. As the polar wind changed direction, Erik felt the cold air on his face and smiled. The same wind that had revealed Thomas's dwelling so many years ago was still blowing, still shaping the landscape, still carrying the voices of the past forward to the future. The knowledge would continue, the warnings would be heeded, the chain would remain unbroken. Erik died the following spring, peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family. His son William took over leadership of the settlement, continuing the traditions his father and Magnus had established. The journals were maintained, the glacier was monitored, the knowledge was shared freely with anyone who wanted to learn. The settlement grew slowly but steadily. More families arrived from the south, drawn by stories of successful communities in the far north. New techniques were developed and added to the collective knowledge. The ancient seeds Sarah had cultivated,
evolved into new varieties, even better adapted to polar conditions. And always, the glacier loomed above them, ancient and powerful. It continued its slow advance and retreat, the cycle playing out over decades and centuries. Sometimes it revealed new frozen dwellings, adding to the collection of warnings and wisdom from the past. Sometimes it simply moved, reshaping the landscape without revealing its secrets. The settlers learned to read the glacier's moods, to predict its movements, to live in harmony with this massive force of nature. They understood that they were temporary visitors in this place, that the ice was permanent in a way they could never be. This understanding kept them humble and cautious. Generations passed.
Erik's descendants continued to lead the settlement, each adding their own contributions to the accumulated knowledge. The wooden carving Thomas had made remained in the communal hall, its simple message, "Together," still relevant after all these years. Scholars came and went, studying the settlement and its practices. Books were written about the northern communities, spreading their knowledge even further. Techniques developed for surviving in polar regions were adapted for other extreme environments: high mountains, deep deserts, frozen tundra. The settlement became a living link between past and future, honoring what had come before while preparing for what would come after. The journals multiplied, each generation adding their observations and experiences. The collection became a comprehensive guide to polar survival, constantly updated and refined. 200 years after Erik first discovered Thomas's frozen dwelling, the settlement still thrived. The descendants of the original families had spread throughout the polar north, establishing new communities and sharing knowledge freely. The glacier had advanced and retreated several times, following its ancient cycle, but no settlement had been caught unprepared since Thomas's time. The warnings had been heeded, the knowledge had been preserved, the chain remained unbroken. A young woman named Emma, named after Thomas and Margaret's daughter, stood before the glacier one morning as the polar wind changed direction. She was a scholar, studying the ancient patterns of human habitation in the far north. She'd read all the journals, from Thomas's original down through 2 centuries of accumulated wisdom. As the wind shifted and the sun hit the glacier at a new angle, Emma saw something she hadn't noticed before: a new section of ice exposed by recent melting, showing the outline of yet another frozen dwelling. She smiled. The glacier was still teaching, still revealing its secrets, and her people were still learning, still adapting, still surviving. As the polar wind changed direction once more, Emma made a note in her own journal. She documented what she saw, what she learned, what she understood. And she knew that someday, perhaps centuries in the future, someone else would read her words and learn from them. The knowledge would continue forward, generation after generation, an unbroken chain connecting past to future. Thomas and Margaret had started it with their warning. Erik and Magnus had honored it, and now Emma and her generation were carrying it forward. The glacier stood eternal, indifferent to human concerns, but the humans had learned its lessons. They'd learned to respect its power, to watch for its warnings, to move when necessary. They'd learned that survival wasn't about conquering nature, but about understanding and adapting to it. And most importantly, they'd learned that knowledge shared was knowledge preserved, that wisdom passed forward was wisdom that could save lives.
That the chain of human understanding, maintained across centuries, was humanity's greatest strength. As the sun continued its low circle around the horizon and the polar wind carried the cold across the ice, Emma turned back toward the settlement. There was work to do, observations to record, knowledge to share, lessons to teach. The glacier would remain, ancient and eternal, but so would the knowledge, passed forward through careful hands and careful minds, ensuring that those who came after would not have to learn everything anew. They could stand on the shoulders of those who came before, building on accumulated wisdom, reaching further because they didn't have to start from the beginning. This was Thomas and Margaret's true legacy, not the frozen dwelling or even the journals themselves, but the understanding that knowledge preserved and shared was the key to human survival, even in the harshest conditions. As the polar wind changed direction one final time, Emma smiled and headed home. The story continued. The knowledge grew. The chain remained unbroken. And somewhere in the ice, perfectly preserved, Thomas and Margaret's dwelling stood as eternal testament to the power of wisdom passed forward through time.
If you enjoyed this story of ancient wisdom, survival across generations, and the enduring power of knowledge passed through time, please subscribe to our channel for more tales of human perseverance in Earth's most extreme environments. Hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories that explore how humanity learns, adapts, and thrives, even in the harshest conditions nature can provide.